Technique 1. Reject self-report. Replace functionally rhetorical questions with more objective forms of impromptu assessment. Such questions are usually greeted with silent assent or perhaps a muttered, yeah. Next, the teacher usually says something like this. Teacher: Good. Let's push on to the role of chloroplasts. Whether they're addressed to adults or kids, in a school, work, or athletic setting, questions like, is everyone clear on, or everybody got it, are functionally rhetorical. They're asked over and over. The question is almost always a passive yes, and it is almost never accurate. Volumes of social science literature have established that self-report is highly unreliable. Questions that ask for binary, that is, yes-no, answers are particularly suspect. Throw in group dynamics in the classroom, and for the great majority of self-report questions, what we get back isn't really even an answer so much as a formality. Whether people understand or not, they almost always say they do, particularly in groups. The result is we get little if any data at a moment when our instincts are telling us we should be assessing. Let's go back to the earlier question. So that cellular structure and the differences between plant and animal cells. Got it, guys? Even if people thought the question was in earnest, most would be reticent to stop a group of 25 people and say, no, actually I don't really understand what you mean by the rigid structure of plant cells. Even if they could, in that moment, 1. Identify that there was something they didn't know, and 2. Describe it quickly so that you can understand it, most people would be unlikely to do so in front of a group that size, out of embarrassment or fear that they would co-opt the better interests of the group. They'd assume they were the only one who didn't get it, and that it wasn't fair to speak up. Even more compelling than implicit social pressure is a deeper problem. Often students don't know that they missed something because, well, they missed it. If they missed your description of the rigid structure of plant cells, they may not know they missed it. Similarly, students often think they understand when they don't, or they don't know how to reflect much on the question of whether they really understand something. When you ask, do you understand the differences between the structures of plant and animal cells, what your students may be assenting to is, for all practical purposes, can you think of something you know about the difference between plant and animal cells? The vague nature of most self-report questions exacerbates this. If our questions aren't directive, they have no reason to draw students' attention to the many things they should know. This encourages them not only to give us false positives, but, possibly, to believe them themselves. Finally, the way we often ask these questions, with a wait time of a fraction of a second, a willingness to accept silent assent without testing, a look of relief even when we get silent assent because we really just want the green light to move on, intimates very clearly that we're not expecting a response. Students know not to speak up. If they do, our response can also send the message that they really weren't supposed to answer. A teacher might offer a perfunctory recap in response to a student who says, "No, actually, I don't get it." "Well, David, do you remember their shape from when we looked at them under the microscope? They had a rectangular pattern. Do they pretty much all look the same? Got it now?" This isn't a message of, "Thank you for that useful data. Let's go back to that," so much as a message of, "Here's what you missed, David." I'll discuss the cultural implications of the messaging around what it means to be in error to a greater extent in Chapter 2. But for now, all David knows is that he was supposed to give his assent and didn't. He'll do better next time. Champion teachers, then, strive to reject self-report as often as they can. They strive to replace moments when they ask for it with a quick series of carefully chosen questions directed at a strategic sample of the class, intended to meaningfully demonstrate student understanding in a minute or less. The trouble with asking, "Got it?" You might be asking, does this mean I can never ask my students, "Got it?" or "Are you ready to go on?" The answer is no. You will assuredly say it sometimes, and doing so is no sin. It's almost impossible to root out such familiar rhetorical habits from your interactions with people, and if you did, it would probably feel unnatural. However, it's powerful and important to recognize how often we use self-report, and how often it is functionally rhetorical. When we ask self-report questions, it's in part because we are acknowledging that we have reached a natural transition point. We have come to a spot where we should check in with students and find out how they are doing. Ironically, asking rhetorically squanders that moment and can actually be counterproductive. Over time, if I ask questions that my students come to realize are not really genuine, if I ask and don't really want answers, the effect may be for students to generalize and assume that many of my questions are perfunctory. It's critical that students feel comfortable sharing their knowledge, or the gaps in it, in the classroom. Making a habit of asking questions that you don't really want people to answer can result in their disengaging at exactly the moment you need them to think deeply, or take the risk of sharing an incipient thought. A look at self-monitoring. I've also watched teachers use a method of check for understanding, CFU, that at first glance may seem similar to self-report, self-monitoring. Unlike self-report, however, self-monitoring is very useful, so it's worth reviewing the differences between self-report and self-monitoring and exploring how, and maybe when, to encourage the latter. Developing self-awareness through self-monitoring. In a recent review of spelling words, Amy Youngman, of Aspire ERES Academy in Oakland, California, said to her students, "At the end, we're going to vote on a scale of 1 to 4 about how confident we feel about taking our test tomorrow, so be thinking about that as you practice the words." You might ask, isn't this just a fancy version of self-report? One where you ask students to evaluate their own level of understanding? Not quite. Amy, at the moment she says this, is also gathering objective data, quickly scanning and assessing her students' answers. She asks for their self-reflections not to assess their level of mastery, it's too unreliable for that, but to develop their own self-awareness, their skill, and their desire to think about whether they are approaching mastery. She advises them, if you gave yourself a 3 or 4, there's a sheet for extra practice you can take home. It's self-monitoring when students reflect intentionally on their own level of mastery. It's a good thing generally, and there are lots of ways to encourage it in the classroom. For example, asking them to reflect as you ask targeted questions, such as, I'm going to ask you some questions now to get a sense of how ready you are to go on. If you're not getting all of these questions, it's a sign that you may need some extra practice. In that case, please come see me. See it in action, Clip 1. Want to see Amy Youngman in action? Watch Amy as she collects data on student mastery by quickly scanning each student's answer. Of course, deliberate self-monitoring can be worked into a lesson in other ways, building synergy with effective CFU. You could, for example, take self-report, a yes or no question asking students to subjectively evaluate their mastery, and replace it with a session in which you give students time to look back at work they've done and select areas where they have questions. In doing this, you'd probably want to use language that assumes there are questions. For example, what questions do you have? I'll give you some time to go back and look over the last 5 problems. You might even then help them reflect by saying, you should know what I mean by anaerobic, and if not, you should be ready to ask about it. You'd probably want to do this activity consistently over time to allow students to build proficiency. Assess by asking objective questions. After a round of guided practice, and just before she released her students at Newark, New Jersey's North Star Academy to a period of independent practice, Katie McNichol asked students to identify problems they'd like to review. At first glance, this might not seem atypical in any way, and perhaps not much different from self-report, but how Katie approached the moment was critical. A sample of hands went into the air, and Katie called on several students. She did not rush. Her message, I am making time for this, and I take it seriously. It is not perfunctory. A student named Youssef asked her to explain what distributing was. Great question, Katie responded. She asked the student to define the term, and then added her own clarification, giving an example. Youssef was still confused, however, so Katie chose an example from her packet for a classmate to tell Youssef specifically how to do this problem. After the explanation, she responded to the student, do the second one for Youssef, and then Youssef is going to do the third. In Katie's hands, then, self-monitoring involves students 1. Identifying specific content they struggled with, rather than evaluating whether they got it. 2. Having sufficient time to engage in reflection with the expectation that there would be questions. And 3. Reviewing, practicing, and being accountable for answering correctly. Youssef ultimately had to show mastery, not just say he felt better about distributing. This sort of self-monitoring, which ends with objective assessment and requires a significant investment in time, is highly valuable, but expensive from a time perspective. For that reason, it's important to make use of the next technique, targeted questioning, to replace self-report at a lower transaction cost, the amount of resources it takes to execute an exchange, be it economic, verbal, or otherwise. This allows you to save self-monitoring for times when it's most important and valuable.